Dispute on how to end the Syrian unrest hits a new level as Moscow says it's being blackmailed to accept military intervention. On this edition of News Analysis, we're asking whether a Western-backed UN Security Council draft resolution is a prelude to war. Does peace still have a chance?
Much to our regret, we see even elements of blackmail. We're told, if you don't agree to adopt a resolution along Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, then we will refuse to extend the mandate of the monitoring mission. I consider this an absolutely counterproductive and dangerous approach, because it is unacceptable to use monitors as a bargaining chip.
Russia believes the threat is meant to push the Kremlin into accepting the Western draft resolution that calls for more sanctions on the Syrian government. The Kremlin, however, has raised concerns that the ultimate aim of including Chapter 7 of the UN Charter is to pave the way for military intervention to topple the Syrian president.
It is blackmailing. We've seen a tremendous activity now from the UN and also from America of their key players now infiltrating the Middle East.
To avoid military action, Moscow has drafted its own resolution that calls for the extension of the UN mission mandate that will expire on Friday. In his latest comments, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov once again backed the UN Arab League's six-point peace plan as the only way out of the crisis. Russia and China have twice vetoed Western-sponsored resolutions against Syria. They fear a UN resolution could lead to a Libyan-style military intervention in the country.
This is political manipulation at the highest level. If you look at the scenario as it occurred in Libya, you've got a similar infrastructure coming into place to manipulate the United Nations into taking action.
Several other countries, including Iran, have also called for a political solution to end the deadly violence. Iran has already announced its readiness to host a meeting between the Syrian government and the opposition. Tehran, rejecting any foreign intervention, believes Syrians are the ones who should decide their own fate. The bloodshed in Syria has already claimed thousands of lives, while mediation has so far failed to end the conflict. The government and the foreign-backed opposition take turns in blaming each other for provoking the unrest. With the violence spreading to Damascus, the situation could soon worsen and ultimately lead to more civilian casualties. Many experts say some Western and Arab countries backing the armed opposition with funds, intelligence, and military equipment are in fact trying to instigate more violence, with aims to push for foreign military action to topple President Assad.
Joining me now live from London is political analyst Mr. Sukant Chandan. With us also live from Beirut, expert in judicial affairs and crime, Mr. Omar Nashabi, and also with us from Coeur d'Alene, author and journalist Mark Glenn. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. My first question to our guest in London, Mr. Chandan. Russia openly using the term blackmail in reference to the West. First of all, what does this signify?
Russia is not under blackmail, and the issue of blackmail is a gross understatement of the way Russia and the whole global south is treated by the Western white power structure. It's not even a gun to the head. We're talking about the biggest, most aggressive military machine, that's NATO, the alliance of Western, its closest allies, really amassing its arsenal against the collective global south, particularly focused against Russia, with the surrounding of Russia by the missile defense systems of NATO, and trickery Clinton, as I like to call her, and Obama, making very clear that there is a shift to China in its military strategy. Hillary Clinton just a week ago again made a great threat against Russia when she said at the Enemies of Syria conference that Russia does not realize that it's going to pay a heavy price for its role in the internal affairs in Syria. And she said that the countries that are allied to NATO, that's Britain and France and America, should let the Russians know that they will pay a price. My concern is this: why is Russia allowing itself to be talked to in such a manner? We know Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Putin are some of the hardest patriots of the global south in relation to NATO. And frankly, they have a lot of hands to play with in their cards to slap back this absolute arrogant nonsense coming from NATO. They've already threatened, actually, that they will conduct a preemptive strike against the missile defense shield that's surrounding them if this missile defense shield does not retreat. So they have got cards to play, which they should play.
Okay, now in Beirut, Mr. Nashabi, let's bring you on this as well. The Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, said that the US and its allies are now saying that they won't extend the UN mission in Syria, of course, if Moscow doesn't support the Security Council draft resolution. Would you also interpret this approach as blackmail or, as Russia says, using the monitors, the UN monitors there as bargaining chips?
Well, I think it would be useful to go back to the beginning of the mission of Kofi Annan and the beginning of the start of the monitoring program. I think there were some interesting voices back then. When the monitors started working in Syria, there was a clear problem on the part of some Western powers that believe that the mission of the monitors is not going to be successful. And so therefore they talked about the failure of the mission in the first week when it first started functioning on the ground. So therefore it doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, this was just to buy some time, and now they feel that they want to move to a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 because during that time they were able to smuggle more weapons and more money into Syria, and therefore mobilize more of their small armed groups inside Syria. And today the battle is taking place in some areas inside the capital, Damascus, and that is a very serious indication of the climax that is an advanced climax, a situation that is a very tense, an escalation that is the most important escalation since the beginning of the trouble in Syria. Now, I think that the position of Russia and the position of China, and also today the position of Iran in calling for dialogue, is in line with the UN Charter, and that everybody must be reminded of that. The UN Charter does not call for the removal of regimes or armed resolutions of conflicts. I mean, the core of the UN Charter is for a political solution for problems such as the problems that Syria is going through. And this is the call from the Islamic Republic in Iran, calling for dialogue, and the Islamic Republic is ready to invite groups from the opposition to Tehran to come and sit in Tehran with the regime and talk things over and see what kind of concessions must be made on both sides in order to reach a peaceful solution. Because with this situation escalating and the battles in the streets, the destruction, and everybody knows, and Lavrov made it very clear that Assad will not fall. So therefore he will remain in power, and the destruction will continue until what? Until all the institutions in Syria are destroyed, and then the NATO would be satisfied. And is this what is going on? Is it a destruction of a country because that country took a strong stand against Israel? I mean, I feel that this is the bottom line.
Right. Mark Glenn now in the US. Let's bring you on this as well. Now, Lavrov was saying that this US and British draft resolution that's been supported by their allies includes requirements that he says are in contrast to the Geneva Agreement. And we know, of course, that that agreement was all about the political transition in Syria. But does this mean that the US and its allies are not interested in that political and peaceful diplomatic solution that Mr. Nashabi was now referring to there?
Yes, and I think that it's important that we bolster what the previous guest said concerning a country that stands up against Israel. That is what is at stake here, is that Syria is one of the last remaining enemies in the region to Israeli expansionism, and this is one of the reasons why Syria has to go in the form of President Assad. So this is extremely important to keep in mind, that that there can be no peaceful resolution of this as long as NATO, as long as the United States and Israel's allies are involved in it, because at the end of the day, what Israel wants to see take place is the destabilization and destruction of the various countries' infrastructure. There was an article that appeared this past week on the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs website. Very powerful group that works in Washington, D.C., works very closely with the U.S. intelligence community and with the U.S. Military. And there was an article entitled, Does the Arab Spring, is Israel the winner of the Arab Spring? And this article was all but gloating over the fact that these various countries, including Syria, are falling apart as Israel remains basically untouched and unscathed by all of this instability. So this is what has to be plugged into the equation here, is that Israel wants to see all of these countries destabilized and breaking apart while she remains very powerful, very strong, and unchallenged in the region.
Right. Back to London now, Mr. Chandon. A lot of comparisons now being made to what happened in the case of Libya. Some observers were saying that Russia right now, what it's trying to avoid is what happened to it when the case of Libya was discussed. We know that back then Russia was against the NATO attacks, saying that these attacks are killing civilians. So do you think this is basically about Russia trying to avoid a repetition of the Libya experience here?
Absolutely, Libya was devastating for the whole global south. I mean, in a period where we were actually strategically winning many battles of resistance vis-a-vis Western imperialism, be it the Second Intifada, the victory of Hezbollah in 2006, the victory of Russia in Georgia in 2008, the Iraqi resistance, the Afghan resistance, etc. Libya was a historic setback. And really, we cannot afford ever to see another setback similar to Libya. And so Russia and China are absolutely right to actually draw a red line against anything like that happening again. But again, I have to stress that, are we going to see Syria fall like we've seen Iraq fall, like we've seen Libya fall? Because you know, Iraq and Libya had some capability at asymmetric warfare, which they did not employ. Gaddafi, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek joke, said NATO has attacked our homes, our families, our offices, so we have a right to strike back at them in Europe. But he never made good on that tongue-in-cheek comment. The point I'm making, I'm not advocating necessarily that they strike back within Europe, but they actually employ, because the point is that we all want a political settlement in Syria. But we know that NATO does not want a political settlement in Syria. It wants to devastate, destabilize Syria so it can negatively impact and knock out Hezbollah in line with an attack on Iran. So Hezbollah in Iran and Ahmed Jibril of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command are absolutely right that in the event of an open NATO attack, that they will rally around and defend Syria. But the open attack, in a way, it's happening already. It hasn't got the official stamp of NATO and the UN Security Council, that's for sure. But the sabotage and the devastation is continuing apace now. When Ho Chi Minh said, and he didn't say just for poetic effect, that the most precious thing for our people is independence and freedom, this is a very profound point, that we haven't attained true independence yet for any country of the global south, because imperialism or the Western white power structure, whatever you want to call it, is its full-time job, 24/7, 365 days a year, every year, decade in, decade out. Its continuous job is to conduct war. When Margaret Thatcher's son was caught by the Zimbabweans and South Africans in trying to conduct a regime change by military coup against Equatorial Guinea and Africa, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is what the Western white power structure is up to all the time. And they're doing this in Syria, so our side have to decide what initiatives can we take. Where is our Latin American family? Where is our African family? Where is our Southeast Asian family? We need to make real initiatives to change the reality on the ground.
Right, well, let's look at the UN Security Council draft resolution that's been put forward now by the states. Mr. Nashabi, this resolution, of course, as you know, includes sanctions. It doesn't, of course, call for a direct military intervention resolution of any sort, but is it a prelude to a military intervention? Right now, in that resolution, Britain and its allies have found the solution in asking the government to withdraw troops, they say, and heavy weapons from population centres within 10 days. Now, how practical is that option going to be? The options of asking the Syrian government to do that and to impose sanctions on it. If a political solution here, a diplomatic solution, can work, how practical is it going to be? How is it going to work? What's the solution that you could describe for us here?
Yes, I think that there's something very important that we need to clarify, is that it's not the wording of the resolution itself and the demands of the resolution. It is the fact that it was passed under, they wanted to be passed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. What does that mean? It means that under Chapter 7, if the Syrian authorities or the concerned groups do not comply with what is mentioned in the resolution, then the United Nations could use force, and therefore could allow the NATO forces, or could create an armed group under the United Nations flag to enforce the resolution. And therefore, when some analysts say that this resolution will actually lead to war, well, it's based on the fact that it's, as Lavrov also emphasized today, is that they want to pass it under Chapter 7. And that is where the analysis comes from. Now, I think it is not completely justified, because the Assad regime has done some steps. I mean, has cooperated, first of all, with the monitors, has cooperated with the demands of the United Nations. Okay, they were not fully enforced on the ground, but yet I said on this program before that I think practically it's very difficult for an army to deal with rogue armed groups shooting at it and weapons being smuggled from outside into the country. It is very difficult for an army to deal with this situation without resorting to violence and to oppressive measures.
Right.
However, that is not fully justified at this point. I just want to say that President Assad did some constitutional reforms. There were some elections in Syria. Okay, also the elections were criticized, they weren't perfect, yet the initiative is an important initiative forward. He appointed a new government, and in that government there's a minister that is with a portfolio that is a specific portfolio for dialogue. And Minister Haidar, whose son has been killed actually during the conflict and who is part of the opposition. So therefore there are members of the opposition in the current government in Syria. These steps, these 4 or 5 steps that were undertaken by President Assad, what do they say? They say that President Assad is ready to make some changes, is ready to listen, is ready to sit on a dialogue table and find a solution for Syria in order to preserve the country. But he has been faced constantly by a massive attack, a diplomatic attack by the West, especially by the United States, France, the UK, and Turkey, as if it is something that, they're using the United Nations, they're using this whole discussion, but the bottom line is they want to destroy Syria, they want to weaken Syria, they want to remove this regime and put a regime that is pro-NATO, pro-Western interests in the region, because Syria under Assad is a problem for NATO's interests and for American interests and Israeli interests in the region.
Right. Mark Lednow, the approach that we're seeing on Syria includes from the one side what Kofi Annan has been pursuing, and on the other side we're seeing, of course, Russia and China and Syria, Iran, that alliance supporting that peace plan, the Syrian government supporting that peace plan, and then the Western-led effort to impose sanctions and to push for some kind of intervention which could be military. Do you think that Kofi Annan's peace plan practically is dead right now, as some observers have been saying? And if it is, who is to blame for killing it?
Well, if it's not dead, then it soon will be. And it will be because of the fact that the West is arming these rebels while it's telling the Assad regime at the same time not to fight back. And I think that this was the plan from the beginning.
That's right.
Is to make the appearances through different political channels to resolve these issues. But, at the end of the day, we're dealing with a tyrant here. This is the narrative that the West would use. We're dealing with a tyrant, and you can't rationalize to people like this. We tried diplomacy, we tried political solutions, but nothing will work, and so the only thing is and so, your previous guest here, Mr. Shamahi, is absolutely correct here. What they're looking for is the destruction of Syria as the Christian and the metamorphosis of Syria into a country that is going to be compliant to Western and NATO and Israeli goals. And we also have to factor into this equation, a very dangerous situation, is the fact that what the United States and Israel want as a secondary but also a very important byproduct of all of this is to push Russia out of the Middle East permanently. This, in many respects, is a replay of the so-called the United States and Israel colluded to an American ship and used this as a pretext for bombing Cairo, which was the Soviet Union's biggest client state and ally in the region, with the intended purpose of pushing the Russian influence out of the Middle East. This is part and parcel of that. They don't want the Russians coming back, and if they have to push the Russians into a military situation in order to achieve this.
Okay, let's just go to London now. We are quickly running out of time. Mr. Chandan, just quickly, if you could give us your opinion on this. Would you also say that there was a concerted effort to destroy Kofi Annan's peace plan from the beginning?
Absolutely. I mean, NATO and its regional allies were very annoyed that the peace plan happened, that took place in the first place. And they've done everything since to really sabotage that. But let me put it to you that when Che Guevara said we need many Vietnams back in the late 60s, he said it in a situation where there was an international struggle for independence of our peoples. Arguably, we're in a stronger position today than we were back in the late 60s. So really from our side, in relation to Syria, in relation to any country in the global south throughout the three continents, we have everything to be confident about. What we need is actually subjective political leadership to push our positions forward and not to allow to be picked off one by one. We need more unity together. We need initiatives with the progressive people within the West and the global south to come and to rally around Syria's defense and any country of the global south's defense who are receiving hostile treatment from NATO.
Sukant Chandan, political analyst, joining us there live from London. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our guest in Beirut, Mr. Omar Nashabi, expert in judicial affairs and crime, and with us, of course, from Coeur d'Alene via Skype from the United States, author and journalist Mark Glenn. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. From me, Homa Lezgi, and the rest of the team here in Tehran, it's goodbye.
Any foreign intervention, believes Syrians are the ones who should decide their own fate. The bloodshed in Syria has already claimed thousands of lives, while mediation has so far failed to end the conflict. The government and the foreign-backed opposition take turns in blaming each other for provoking the unrest. With the violence spreading to Damascus, the situation could soon worsen and ultimately lead to more civilian casualties. Many experts say some Western and Arab countries backing the armed opposition with funds, intelligence, and military equipment are in fact trying to instigate more violence, with aims to push for foreign military action to topple President Assad.
Joining me now live.
Bargaining chip.
Russia believes the threat is meant to push the Kremlin into accepting the Western draft resolution that calls for more sanctions on the Syrian government. The Kremlin, however, has raised concerns that the ultimate aim of including Chapter 7 of the UN Charter is to pave the way for military intervention to topple the Syrian president.
It is blackmailing. We've seen a tremendous activity now from the UN and also from America of their key players now infiltrating the Middle East.
To avoid military action, Moscow has drafted its own resolution that calls for the extension of the UN mission mandate that will expire on Friday. In his latest comments, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov once again backed the UN Arab.
From London is political analyst Mr. Sukhant Chandan. With us also live from Beirut, expert in judicial affairs and crime, Mr. Omar Nashabi, and also with us from Coeur d'Alene, author and journalist Mark Glenn. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. My first question to our guest in London, Mr. Chandan. Russia openly using the term blackmail in reference to the West. First of all, what does this signify?
Russia is not under blackmail, and the issue of blackmail is a gross understatement of the way Russia and the whole global south is treated by the Western white power structure. It's not even a gun to the head. We're talking about the biggest, most aggressive military machine.
Dispute on how to end the Syrian unrest hits a new level as Moscow says it's being blackmailed to accept military intervention. On this edition of News Analysis, we're asking whether a Western-backed UN Security Council draft resolution is a prelude to war. Does peace still have a chance?
Much to our regret, we see even elements of blackmail. We're told, if you don't agree to adopt a resolution along Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, then we will refuse to extend the mandate of the monitoring mission. I consider this an absolutely counterproductive and dangerous approach, because it is unacceptable to use monitors as a
League's six-point peace plan as the only way out of the crisis. Russia and China have twice vetoed Western-sponsored resolutions against Syria. They fear a UN resolution could lead to a Libyan-style military intervention in the country.
This is political manipulation at the highest level. If you look at the scenario as it occurred in Libya, you've got a similar infrastructure coming into place to manipulate the United Nations into taking action.
Several other countries, including Iran, have also called for a political solution to end the deadly violence. Iran has already announced its readiness to host a meeting between the Syrian government and the opposition. Tehran rejected